In Britain, the Brexit crisis that has consumed the country is also raising questions about the fragility of their liberal democracy. How lasting will the impact be on Britain and other liberal democracies? And in America, outrage continues to simmer regarding a college admissions scandal that's exposed the role of money and privilege in one of the world's most expensive educational systems. What can be done to level the playing field? Welcome to The Point, an opinion show coming to you from Beijing. I'm Li Xin. Is liberal democracies dying? In 2016, two of the world's proudest democracies experienced earthquakes that shook the foundation of their political systems. The British voted for Brexit, which meant leaving the European Union. The Americans voted in Donald Trump as president, which meant a swing toward the hard right. On both sides of the Atlantic, critics bemoan these as devastating blows to liberal democracy. Some questioned if it was dying or even dead. Today, though, the situation grows worse for both nations, particularly Britain, which is on the brink of a Friday deadline that may see it break irrevocably from the European continent. So much of today's chaos seems linked to a core tenet of liberal democracy, the will of the people. In an election or referendum, each adult citizen is entitled to a vote, regardless of how well informed they are. Yet, how much damage have Brexit and Trump done to liberal democracy? Why are such phenomena produced under the system? Have they undermined an entire political system or only shaken society's faith in the system? And what impact, if any, has it had on liberal democracies elsewhere in the world? Joining our discussion today are, in our Beijing studio, Professor Wang Yiwei, the Jean Monnet Chair at Renmin University here in China, and from our Brussels studio, Professor Young Palmowski, Professor of Modern History of the School of Modern Languages of the University of Warwick. Gentlemen, welcome to The Point. Professor Palmowski, let me go to you first. What exactly do experts and politicians mean when they refer to liberal democracies? And often we say Western liberal democracies. What specific features characterize such a system or distinguish it from other systems of government?
Well, these systems are characterized by separation of powers, so that you don't have a concentration of power. They are normally characterized by regular democratic elections. They are characterized amongst the separation of powers by an independent judiciary, so that you really have a carefully worked out system that no single system can dominate the other.
What about the one person, one vote? How important is that feature to that system, Professor Palmowski?
So it's absolutely critical, of course, that the importance of free and fair elections of all citizens is a central tenet to the system, to the representative nature of Parliament that is then being elected to express the will of the people.
Mm-hmm. Professor Wang here in the studio, what could be possibly the negative features of such a system? What sort of negative impact might those features have upon society overall and upon the masses when we talk about one person, one vote? Are there any preconditions to the ideal execution of such a system?
Well, democracy is maybe not the best, but it's not the worst in all kinds of the political systems. Well, because of the hundreds of years development, the marginal beneficial decrease in effect. Now it's very clear that these systems maybe in the past worked so well, but in current situation, particularly in the UK and the United States, which in the 1980s had a leading role to usher in so-called new liberalism, globalization. So I think they suffered of such kind of mega bubble and the financial crisis, and then the political system also be impacted.
Why do you say that? Under what factors have the effectiveness of the Western liberal democracy been impacted negatively?
Yeah, because of the new liberalism-driven globalizations, more focus on off capital, by capital, and for capital. So which is against of the people, by the people, and for the people. each person to vote independently. But actually, each people, the inner wealth is so huge divide. The 1% people will hold over the 90% of the wealth. So this kind of the so-called free elections, and actually it's not the so kind of free. It's actually the voting for the rich people, and the rich people dominate the election, and this make the elites and the confrontation with the mass and the people.
But however, the outcome of the Brexit vote and the outcome of the election of President Trump is quite the opposite of the elitist feature that you discussed. What are the factors there then, Professor Wang, very briefly?
Well, this is called so-called populism, and many Western scholars consider about this is occasional. It's not essential or even the phenomenon of the liberal democracy. I think this is like a chicken and the eggs problem. This is the egg, but who produced the egg is the chicken. So I think the liberal democracy caused this referenda and the Brexit and the populism. I think they're both the egg and the chicken.
Okay, very interesting analogies here. Professor Palmowski, I wonder your thoughts on what Professor Wang just said about this chicken and egg. Exactly what is the source of the problem? Is the liberal democratic system a problem in itself, or is it at peril because of some phenomena that are only produced because of recent developments in the economy, in the Western economy, for instance?
So I have to say I disagree somewhat with my colleague, and that is because you have gross inequalities and growing inequalities of wealth in any system, and not just in liberal democracies. I mean, just think of Russia, for instance. And these are then expressed in the political system. The question is how you deal with that, and it seems to me that there are challenges to liberal democracies these days, and the question then is how these democracies can renew themselves and can deal with these shocks. One example, for instance, of a system that has been able to absorb this kind of shock in the past is France. I mean, you've had a completely new political movement that sprung up over the last few years, and that then generated, led by the current French President Emmanuel Macron. And it's entirely possible that the United Kingdom will see something very similar emerging over the next few months and years as the political system realigns around the consequences of Brexit. So I'm not quite so pessimistic, I have to say, about the fate of liberal democracy and its ability to adapt to the forces of globalization.
Of course, a vibrant system would be able to heal itself, and yet just looking at the Brexit referendum, it is actually quite startling that such an important and complicated issue was put to the vote by people when the information was really rather scarce, and it's really not a black and white question or yes and no question, and yet it was put to the vote of the people. I mean, how much more does the system have to develop itself? Does the system need to mature in order for such a simplistic approach to be avoided, so that you don't drive onto speed bumps along the road? Mr. Palmowski, Professor Palmowski.
So I think you articulated the problem extremely well, and that's exactly why the UK political system is now grappling with the consequences of this referendum. But this was not a problem of liberal democracy. This was the problem that a mature parliamentary democracy was suddenly undermined by an attempt at direct democracy through the vote of the people, through a referendum, when it was really not used to dealing with this, when the referendum campaigns were led by people who had no accountability over the outcomes. And so now you have Parliament trying to grapple with the consequences of a referendum whose outcome was not at all clear. So if you do have to have a referendum, if you do want to organize a referendum, you have to do so carefully. You have to look at some models where this works very well. There are some models, of course, Switzerland is the most famous model, but Ireland has had some very good experiences with running referenda, where the state has had a very neutral, arbitrating role in organizing these referenda and providing information on both sides. And in the UK, this simply hasn't worked, and I think one of the big consequences, I think, of the current mess is that I think this attempt at direct democracy won't be repeated for a very long time.
Professor Wang, what are your thoughts here? We actually touched upon several points, right? The direct democracy, otherwise, in other words, the referendum, why it works in some Western societies, but it doesn't in some other. For instance, in the case of Switzerland, it actually has a very proud tradition of direct democracy, and yet in the case of Great Britain, it doesn't. But in the case of Switzerland, not everything is decided by referenda. There are this parliamentary representation system that is also functioning very well. How come things can be fairly effectively combined in Switzerland and not in Great Britain, Mr. Wang?
Very good question. I think the Brexit is the responsible of the elites. They cannot make a decision and then just put the people to make the choice. But sometimes the people that don't have enough information about the European Union, about the British difficulties. After the Brexit, many British people were astonished about that. So they Googled what's the European Union. Millions increased. So that means for those who regret that vote for yes for the referenda, actually they don't know about what's the real meaning of the European Union and the relations between Britain and the European Union. So referenda maybe works in Switzerland, in some countries, but because every citizens can have the independent views without the full access to information, so they can make a decision. But actually, this is not happening in the UK. So that means they cause many troubles. At the same time, they make another troubles again after Brexit. It seems out of the House of the Commons. They are not just thinking about the long term and whole interest of the UK, and even for the European Union as a whole. They are just thinking about their party interests, their personal interests. The Labour Party, the Conservative parties, even inside of them, they are disputing each other. They are just they know, they don't want to know what they don't want to have, but they don't know what they want to have. So it's like the European leaders condemn that it's not a Brexit, it's just the European Union exit from the UK.
Okay, Professor Palmowski, here we touch upon the parliamentary system, and Professor Wang talks about people just quarrel there and they don't really look long enough, or they don't represent the whole of the country, rather just their political party or just themselves. I understand some people would argue that these people represent the constituents that voted into that place. How can you combine the interests of both into this issue, the long-term overall interest of the country and the short-term interest of that individual constituent that voted a certain member of parliament into place, Mr. Palmowski?
So I think this has to be a question of political leadership. I mean, I think in the present time it is particularly difficult, but one of the things that we lack in the UK is a clarity of vision on any side, really. It's very difficult to find anybody who supports Brexit, who can actually articulate a very clear vision about the journey that's ahead and what the future holds in a very concrete way. And I think that is a problem. Let me just make one additional comment, because I think it was spurred by something that Professor Wang said, and that is a systemic issue about liberal democracy, which is this question of the degeneration of the public sphere, and especially in the sense of the fourth estate. How do you sustain neutral, how do you generate good political outcomes and generate political support for them when the press increasingly is beholden to big corporate interest and to certain political persuasions? You have this problem in the United States. You have this problem with a very big section of the press, both mainly printed press, in the United Kingdom, and that's a big problem. For 20 years, you've had a completely falsifying press landscape with regard to the European Union, and I think that lack of information and that lack of a good quality debate about the European Union in the long run has hugely contributed to this problem in the short run, and there's a real question about what to do with it.
Sure, indeed. We have to leave it there. Many thanks to my guests, Professor Wang Yiwei, the Jean Monnet Chair at Renmin University, and Professor Jan Palmowski, Professor of Modern History of the School of Modern Languages of the University of Warwick. Indeed, a huge topic, but we're going to leave it there today. You have been watching The Point with me, Liu Xin. We'll take a short break, and when we come back, we'll hear the latest Panelist about one of the biggest college bribery scandals in American history and what it says about the country's system of higher education. Stay with me.